allow time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. We don't have time to answer all of them. We will make them available on our site. Next slide. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we've been in business for over 35 years, providing electronic digitization and conversion services for all forms of content, delivering exceptional quality to meet the exacting needs of our customers. We have extensive experience in content analytics, high-quality OCR, metadata extraction, content validation and enrichment, and transformation to the format of your choice, including populating downstream databases and downstream systems, all leveraging leading-edge technologies, including artificial intelligence, to decompose and annotate your content and convert it to XML and other advanced structured data tagging schemes, preparing your content for tomorrow's technology. Next slide. DCL Services help you maximize the value of your content, refining your document conversion strategy, identifying document redundancy and reuse opportunities, extracting metadata to improve search precision, and transforming legacy and future documents to meet your business needs today and in the future. Next slide. We serve a very broad client base. Next slide, please. Spanning all industries. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Phil Barrett, Vice President, Sales and Marketing at Delta XML. Phil's career began as a postgraduate in social sciences, psychology, and social work. And following his education, he secured a position as an XML sales engineer, where he developed his understanding of the XML industry. Embracing his skills and knowledge in XML, Phil saw himself in a variety of high-level sales and marketing roles within the XML industry, which has provided him with a unique perspective and understanding of the industry, which he now uses to support Delta XML. He has over 25 years in the XML industry. Also on today's webinar, we have Tristan Mitchell, Product Manager at Delta XML. Without further ado, please welcome Phil and Tristan.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all those who've joined today. Really appreciate your presence here on this first change management webinar. I'd also like to thank DCL for hosting Delta XML today. It's very much appreciated. Here's the agenda you can see in front of you for the webinar today. We're going to introduce ourselves, Delta XML, a little bit more for those who don't know us, and then cover the high-level detail of change management, how to think about change profitably, and we'll consider different types of change, how to identify change, and then show some real examples of how to visualize change in different industries. Next slide, please. So a quick introduction to Delta XML. There's a few of our customers, as you can see on this slide. We've been in the business of comparison and merge technology for a long time, and so words like accuracy, reliability, flexible, and great support are the cornerstones to our technology in our business. As you can see from the slide, we punch well above our weight in terms of, especially for a medium-sized organization. And we have been called a boutique software vendor. We serve a fairly niche market, but it's very well served by ourselves in terms of the offerings that we make. We've got two routes to market. The first route, which is probably the largest at the moment, is where Delta XML is embedded or OEM'd, and that's the route where we work with many CMS vendors, database vendors, authoring environment vendors, and they've chosen Delta XML instead of attempting to build an in-house solution. The other route is the direct route. We have hundreds of small, medium, and large organizations and enterprises who rely on Delta XML. They identify and publish their publish change in their valuable content. Okay, next slide, please. So the phrase there, when documents are the product, we talk to many customers and partners where their products are in the form of content. They can be web pages, they can be PDFs, they can be on-machine applications. And this slide looks at a few of those areas in industry that we deal with. So standards. The standards organization example here is, well, there's a couple of them. There's the ISO, there's the National Fire Protection Association, country standards bodies in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, for example. They all manage change within XML. And then these changes are passed on to their customers, and that's the key area. In financial reporting, many of you will know XML is used widely in financial reporting, with organizations including the likes of Merrill leading the way from very early on. And Merrill, for example, the Merrill Corporation are now in their second or third generation platforms where change in their content features very high in terms of what's passed on to their customers. Standards such as XBRL are now very much mainstream, and again, within that specific area, change is very important and change management is very important. The publishing industry is one where I've had most experience, and passing on change in content has been mainstream for a long time. From a legal publishing, companies such as LexisNexis and LexisNexis use XML right through their business sectors. Pearson, as an example of an educational publisher, is a great example here, and where their content is changing all the time, and again they have to pass on the identification and visualization of that change to their customers. And in professional services, examples here of where change management is vital is health and safety, for example, where legislation and best practice mean that important changes have been brought to the attention of the consumers. Okay, next slide, please. So we're going to have a little poll at this time, a question for people who are all attending. You can see that there's 6 different categories of publishers here: standards, pharmaceutical, news, fiction, tech docs, and financial services. So the question that we would like to, there's 2 questions in fact, but the first question is, in your opinion, which category changes most rapidly? So the content in which category changes most rapidly? You can see there's a choice there of actually just the 5 of them. Okay. So this is a quick poll. We'll move on to the next question. And here we're trying to say, in which category does change have the biggest impact? So that change, that should come again in this. The question should arrive again shortly. There you go. So for which of these document types does change create the biggest impact? Again, be interested in that. Okay, so we'll feed back the results of that quick poll as we move forwards. Okay, next slide, please. So here you'll see our own opinions or ideas on what the chart might look like if we took everybody's opinions into account. See if you agree. You may not, and that's absolutely fine, because change is very contextual, and as we'll say a number of times during this presentation, it means different things to different people. So just to have a look at this slide in a little bit more detail, taking pharmaceutical data, just by way of explanation as to in terms of what we're talking about in terms of change. Pharmaceutical data may not change very often, but when it does, the impact can be critical. It can be life-threatening, it can be life-saving. So there's an example of where change doesn't happen very often, but the impact of the change is very important. A nice little addition here, we put fiction in there, and in the case of fiction, it changes very little. And when it does change, we guess it may not be that important. Others may disagree. The standards industry is a classic here, where frequent change happens, and the changes will most likely be important and significant. News is a good example. News changes rapidly from first edition, and but the change in this case may only add or clarify details to the news that's already been presented. And as we've said earlier on, financial services data can change very, very quickly, you know, by the second even, and the impact of that change, or at least knowing about that change, might be crucial for investors to whether to buy or sell, for example. We've put tech docs in there, something that we're very familiar with, and the reason we say technical documents goes where it is because sometimes it can change very fast, sometimes it doesn't change too much, but when it does change, it's really important. And as I say, we've got lots of experience in that area with things like DITA. So here, it's not about having the latest version of the content as we're putting it here, but also seeing how the content has changed. Next slide, please. So why is change valuable? We've just put some bullets up there, and we've highlighted the key words in there, and I'll talk about those now for a moment. So visualizing change is a way of giving extra information to the consumer of that change. A good example here is, for example, a standard maintenance manual. If we take an engineer, they'll be able to see highlighted change, and so that engineer knows not to carry out, for example, a normal process, because the change in that process has been highlighted and it's very easy to see. And we know from experience that creating an easy to understand interface for change can lead to safer and faster maintenance. When we're talking here about providing the competitive advantage, a good example here is that more and more financial services content vendors are offering the option to view the evolution of content, the history of the content and how it's changed. They can compare with what was said at one point in time against another, and as I said earlier, it could affect a buy or a sell, for example. One area where understanding and recording change is very important, as I'm sure you guys will know, is in the regulatory and compliance-based markets, where the ability to show evidence of change to regulators is needed, and operators must ensure that practices are up to date. And this leaves the obvious area for profitability, and that's time saving. The generic time saving benefits for the consumer are obvious. I started my career way back when paper was published in the form of loose leaf folders, and I can remember that the changes that were then published were in small cellophane covered packs with an instruction page at the beginning to say, take these pages out, put these pages in. And I could never understand from that explanation why. Why were people just being told where to put the changes and not what the changes were? And that's because on paper it was very difficult to capture that. So all of these create value. All of this change management creates value and converts into commercial value as well as competitive advantage. Okay, next slide, please. Which changes are valuable? Again, going back to my early days in the editorial side, you'll see here some copy editing symbols, and the reason we put these in again is just a bit of fun to show how changes changed, dare I say, over time. And so from the paper-based editorial function, there still exists a very well-established set of copy editing symbols to highlight change on the written page. And as you'll see there, it takes the form of similar to shorthand. And that's still very much used on paper-based editorial systems. But technologies move forwards, and we've now moved through the traditional and cumbersome paper-based workflows through to sophisticated change management techniques that we're familiar with. Added to the standard changes, as you're seeing here, deletions, replacements, insert spaces, transpose. Do you want to click, Tristan, for me, just showing a few others? And here we can see on the other one there, the good old lowercase all initial caps was another one. Added to those changes in content, structural changes are now important, and we're able to capture that change. Delta XML is certainly stands out in that sense, but also from the collaboration point of view and content management, change has become much easier to work with in those workflows. Okay, next slide. So building on that, the three categories we've got in front of us, the changes, the context, and the stakeholders. As I've said before, additions and deletions, corrections, change of emphasis, moved content, spelling corrections, and metadata can all have different contexts, and the contexts we've mentioned here are the authoring process. So additions and deletions and corrections may have different meaning in the authoring process. It may be from the editorial and review perspective, people need to know more about spelling corrections and change of emphasis. But again, the value to the stakeholders here, how an author is able to capture change is very important. We'll cover that a little bit later on. But also from the editor's point of view, how quickly can a review take place? And then, of course, the most important focus for this presentation, of course, is the customer. How can you use change profitably when the customer or the consumer of that content is faced with change? Okay, next slide. So this is where I hand over to Tristan Mitchell. As Tammy said, Tristan's the product manager for all of the Delta XML products. And again, we're trying to have a little bit of fun here. So I'm going to hand over to Tristan, put myself on mute, which is probably the best thing, and see you at the other end of the presentation.
Thanks, Phil. Just one thing that you forgot to do, Phil, is to read the results of those polls. So I just want to do that quickly first. The first poll, where people were asked to say which type of content changes the most rapidly, well, the most popular answer on that was news, with 41% of people suggesting that news changes the most rapidly. And for the second question about which category has the biggest impact when it changes, I think 63% of people chose standards for that. So you were mostly thinking on the same wavelength as us, but as Phil said, that's just our opinion, and other opinions are available. But as Phil said, it's time to change pace a little bit now and pause for a bit of fun. So we're going to play a game of Spot the Difference, and this slide's already been up for a while, so hopefully you've already been thinking about it. On the screen, you'll see two images based on Van Gogh's Bedroom in Arles. They're defined in the XML-based SVG format, and these images are different, and your job is to work out how many differences there are just by looking at them, just like in the Spot the Difference books that you looked at when you were younger. There should now hopefully be a poll appearing on your screen with some options, so I'll leave the slide for a few more seconds and you can make your choices. Okay, we're getting quite a good percentage of people voting, which is great. Okay, so I'll move on. Van Gogh was known for creating different versions of his paintings, and he painted this painting at least 3 times. This image is based on the third version of the image. I'll just show you what the different images look like. This is his first version. and that's on permanent loan to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. This second version is owned by the Art Institute of Chicago, and the third version, which we just saw, is in the French National Collection and is on permanent display in the Musée d'Orsay, Paris. But you didn't come here for an art history lesson. We were playing Spot the Difference, so I'll just move on to the results. And it looks like 12% of you got it right. There are 9 differences. We're seeing now them animated, but I'll also highlight them. So you can just see which ones you spotted and which ones you missed. And if you were wrong, which I guess the vast majority of you were, you'll understand how difficult it is to find even a small number of changes just by looking at 2 different images. We used our XML comparison tool to compare the SVG images, identify the changes, and then create an animation that flashes the changes, as you can see on the screen. But more on that in our next slide. How do you find change? How to find change is a subject we often talk about with our customers. It's one of our main areas of expertise, and it's really what our customers come to us for. Given 2 versions of a document, whether that's in the middle of the editorial process or perhaps 2 released versions of a document, how can you identify the differences between them? When it comes to document content, what that usually really means is how has the textual content in this document changed between the different versions? Structural changes, changes to parts of the document that we don't really see, perhaps metadata, things like that, they tend to be less important than changes to the actual content. Amazingly, we often find that the existing solution is what we call the stare and compare method. Looking at 2 versions side by side, page by page, turning the pages in a document over one by one, either on a screen or in print form. And this is also what your customers will resort to if you don't provide a marked up version of the changes. The problem with this technique, I think they're fairly obvious. It can be an extremely laborious process, especially for large documents, and it's relying on people, so it's bound to be error prone. It's not difficult to see that changes will easily be missed. A slightly more robust but still largely manual process is to use some way of marking what's changed in the source itself as it's being written. The manual way of achieving that is for the author or the editor of the document to use constructs in the source that highlight where changes have occurred. Again, it's a manual process, and it's going to be easy to overlook certain changes or perhaps to put the markup in the wrong way. So moving on to using a track change feature of an editor sometimes will remove that manual aspect of the process, but track changes can come with its own set of problems as well. Depending on the software you're using and the capabilities of its track changes feature, it may or may not provide all you need. There can be certain types of change that aren't tracked. The thing we often see is changes in tables, particularly when those changes are structurally complex, or perhaps changes to the styling of words. Add to that the possibility that the feature hasn't been turned on, either accidentally or God forbid, intentionally, and changes can be missed that way as well. Track changes works very well for minor changes or for changes over a short period of time with perhaps 1 or 2 authors, but once they start to build up within a document created by lots and lots of different authors over a longer period of time, they become really messy, difficult to understand and unwieldy. The most robust way to identify change is to use a fully automated comparison process. This allows you to take any 2 versions of a document and identify precisely what's changed between the versions without worry of human error. Comparison identifies all of the changes without overlooking any. An additional benefit over track changes is you can change the scope of the change. So it's just as easy to find the changes between, let's say, versions 2 and 6 of a document as it would be to find the differences between version 4 and 6. If you've actually used track changes to store those differences, then it can be really difficult to change the scope of the view that you're seeing in an easy way. We always recommend an automated comparison tool for identifying change between versions. So how does XML help with change? One of the main benefits of XML when it's used for document content is to provide structure to a document. Instead of being made up of a continuous stream of words, perhaps broken up with carriage returns, marking paragraphs, the document structure is defined unambiguously using elements and then sometimes with attributes as well. This makes it much easier to process automatically and address any part of the document using technologies like XPath, for example. And then that ease of processing leads to reduced production times, which then, of course, leads to greater profit. Having a well-defined structure creates additional benefits when it comes to comparison. A hierarchy of sections instead of a flat structure where all the words are just and the paragraphs are flat, that hierarchy helps in the alignment phase of comparison and can actually also have a positive effect on the performance of comparison tools. Being able to address specific parts of the document using XPath or other technologies means you can easily specify any areas in the source where perhaps changes should be ignored or you need to process those changes in some other kind of way. And of course, all the standard benefits of XML apply to change as much as they do to the rest of content. So it's simple to repurpose any change that's been identified in the document to use it for different things, whether that's displaying change in the kind of main body of a document inline, or creating a table of contents or a table of changes, or even to extract changes out of the document into a separate document, like a change report or an errata document. Once you've identified change, you need to have a sensible way of representing it in your source files if you're going to be able to use it then in your publishing workflow. The representation of change is closely coupled with how it's identified in the first place. If you're using a track changes feature, you're likely going to be storing change in whatever form the track changes uses, and that's typically going to be processing instructions, but sometimes it's element based depending on which system you're using. But of course, there are other ways to store change. If you're manually marking changes, you could simply use styling to render content differently if it's been changed. We wouldn't recommend that approach. In fact, it's better to leave all styling information out of source documents and concentrate on markup that has semantic significance. We make use of a format that we call our Delta format, and that uses elements and attributes in a separate namespace which describe how the structure and the content of the document have changed. It's designed specifically for simple processing, usually done with XSLT, and it keeps the document in a form that's as close as possible to the original source. So that if you've got a code that processes those documents already, then you need minimal changes to that to adapt it to use the Delta. But many grammars, XML grammars, have their own native way of representing changes. So DITA and DocBook, for example, they have attributes in them that can be added to almost all of the elements that represent the change status of that element, whether it's added or deleted or modified, for example. The beauty of using XML is that a Delta file that contains all of the changes can easily be transformed using XSLT into the required markup to suit your workflow. If changes are represented as track change processing with the processing instructions and things like that, then that kind of transformation of the changes becomes much, much more difficult. So we've looked at finding change and we've looked at representing change in source. But if you're going to use change to create a profitable product, you need some way of visualizing it in your end output. So like finding and processing change, we recommend making change visualization part of an automated process. Integrating the publication of change into your existing publication workflow is easy if you make sure that changes are represented in an appropriate way in your source. Then it can be as simple a matter as updating CSS or an XSLT script to create the correct output in your published document. But it's important to design the view of change to suit your customers, your publication platform, and the document itself. You need to consider the media type of the publication. Is it dynamic or is it static? Dynamic output, such as HTML5 or a web app of some kind, provides different capabilities and options for showing change than a static PDF would or a printed document, for example. And then you have to answer the question of how detailed do you want your change report to be? Do you need to show all of the changes in line or with change bars perhaps and text highlighting, or is it going to be sufficient to create a summary of changes, or even just to indicate which sections have changed in the table of contents for the document? We're going to see some examples in a moment, but there are other considerations like predictable pagination that can affect how change is visualized. Including all of the deleted and added content is going to change the length of your document and affect the layout. So if layout is an issue, you need to consider the techniques with which you mark the change. As you can see, there's lots to think about when deciding how change will be shown in the final output. With the correct change representation and processing, creating the correct view for you is much easier. Which view to create depends on the requirements of the reader and the appropriateness for them. So we're going to move on now to look at some real examples of output that some of our partners and our customers are creating. And many of these examples are examples of documents that are a product of that organization, and they either create revenue directly because of because they are the product, or they create revenue indirectly as a result of creating differentiation for the organization that's using them. So the first example is from an online platform for drafting and reviewing legal documents related to capital markets transactions. As you can see in the legend on the right, ScribeStar use text formatting to represent change within the documents. We usually see people using red text for deletion and green text for addition, but here ScribeStar are using blue for additions and green is used to highlight content that's moved within the document, so from one part of the structure to another. And using text decoration can be really important actually, because around 8% of men of European descent are red-green colorblind. So having red and green with no decoration to show deletion and addition can actually be very problematic for people who are colorblind, of course. This next example is a standard published by the National Fire Protection Association. And this is the output of a project carried out by RICAN, who are a content engineering partner. As we heard earlier, standards bodies are a prime example where including change in publications can be hugely valuable to the customer. This output is slightly different. You can see the legend at the bottom there. The NFPA had a requirement to maintain pagination in their documents based on the pagination of the latest version of the standard. This means that they don't include deleted content in this view, but they indicate where blocks have been deleted using a bullet marker like this. Inline text changes are highlighted with shading, but again, deleted text isn't included. That's just the latest version of that paragraph. And then completely new blocks are indicated with a symbol at the start of the block, like that. And we'll look at in a little bit more detail at the RICAN NFPA project in a few slides' time. This next example is a test document produced by a partner representing an investment bank. Their final system's still work in progress, but this example shows some of their work in progress thoughts, how they're going to represent change to different structural components in a document. And note again that they've used blue and not green to represent insertions. So that seems to be different from what we normally expect and what we often see, but there seems to be a common pattern of using red and blue rather than red and green, which is good. So we're going to move back now to the standards industry. This is a part of the ISO 9001 specification, which is taken from ISO's web-based HTML view of the standard. In the online HTML view, you can view it normally like this, or you can select a button to show you a red line view, and that shows you a marked up view like this. ISO have used red and green for insertions and deletions, but they've used text decoration to improve readability for those who are colorblind. And they have this information panel at the top, which lets readers know exactly what they're looking at, which details the two document versions that they can see. To finish, I'd like to look in a bit more detail at the project RICAN carried out for the National Fire Protection Association. The NFPA publish around 300 safety codes and standards, which are typically hundreds or even thousands of pages long. For their customers, understanding exactly what's changed between editions is critical. the NFPA were using a manual method of marking change, and that took around 70 hours for each standard update. And because that was so labor intensive, they were only producing the red line versions of documents for their top 50 publications. RICAN implemented a new system for them that used Delta XML to automatically compare editions of standards and produces that red line markup and bring the time down from 70 hours per update to less than 1. Across the 50 publications, that's a saving of over 3,500 hours. With the resources they freed up, they were able to produce redline documents for all of their publications and not just the top 50. And they're also now looking at implementing a new HTML-based interactive documents to make viewing changes even easier for their customers. So whether this is about saving time, creating extra revenue from having a richer publication, or creating differentiation in your product, identifying and representing change across your document revisions can lead directly to increased profitability. Thanks very much for listening, and we're going to have some time now for questions.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Phil and Tristan. I believe that everyone will agree that today's webinar was very informative, and we can all think of many ways to leverage Delta XML in our current projects. There were several questions submitted, so let me go through the first one. In the XML file, does the author need to identify the difference between the versions? That wasn't clear to me.
Okay, I'm happy to take that one. Yeah, so I was trying to highlight that there are lots of different ways of showing change. So there are methods of showing change where perhaps the author might manually mark up the change. There are systems where people will use a track changes system in an editor to show change. But the way we would recommend is to use a comparison tool, and that then does things completely automatically. You would just input the two different document versions into the comparison tool, and that would identify the difference between the versions without the author having to do anything.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. That would be very clear then. Next question was, how can I visualize the structural changes? Which I think is a very similar question, right?
Yes, yeah, in a way. I mean, again, it's down to something which is going to be automated, and it all depends on what it is that you're wanting to visualize. As I mentioned earlier, it's typically a case of wanting to show the changes to textual content in a document. But if there are structural changes, so perhaps paragraphs have moved around, that's the one we typically get is how do I support moves and structural changes with moves. Then there are ways that you can manipulate a Delta file, and that's one of the kind of beauties of having the changes represented in XML in the Delta file, is that you can process them. So you can do things like finding moved content, and you can find other kinds of structural change to be able to visualize that in your document as well if you want to. But it all depends on the context of what it is that you want to show.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Next question is, can you find changes in the HTML itself?
Well, as our name suggests, we're Delta XML, so we would normally support finding differences in XML documents. We get asked a lot if HTML can be compared, and the answer is, I suppose, that it depends. One of those non-answers. If the HTML is XHTML, which then is an XML input, then yes, you can use it as inputs, and you can compare XHTML documents and create a result in XHTML. We get a lot of requests for an HTML specific comparison tool though, so it's something we're looking at doing, and if people are on the call are interested in seeing that kind of product, then we'd be very interested to hear your opinions, and do let us know if that's something which would interest you.
Okay, so we definitely encourage anyone on the call that has an interest in that to reach out to both of you. Next question, how can we find changes from a team of reviewers?
Okay, what we've looked at so far is comparison, which is two-way. So we're looking at showing change between two versions of a document, whether that's two versions that are very close together or two versions that are perhaps further apart in time and more different. The question of looking at changes from multiple people is that you need to do a different kind of comparison. And we have technology, as Phil mentioned at the start, we have technology as well for merging content. So where you've got multiple people making changes to a document, like you would have in a review cycle, then we have other products that allow you to merge those changes together, which is effectively doing multiple comparisons all on the fly, and comparing revisions from lots of different people all at once and bringing that together into a single document. So yeah, multiple versions, multiple changes from different people is something we could support with other parts of our product set.
That's great, because I definitely imagine that a lot of companies have a team of reviewers that need to collaborate. So that should be very helpful. How does a comparison tool fit into a workflow?
Well, as Phil said, we have different routes to market. So we have a lot of OEM customers who will build our comparison tools perhaps into a CMS, and then they give those capabilities of comparison to all of their customers, and perhaps they may not even understand or know that they're using Delta XML. But we also have that kind of direct route as well, where we are providing effectively a toolkit for comparison. So it's a Java API, for example. You would write some code against it, and you would build that into a system that you have already, and make calls to the comparison. Where it kind of fits in the workflow depends on what it is that you want to do. If you are trying to put changes into a published version, like most of the examples that we've seen today, then you're going to want to do that fairly close to the publication stage. So just before you publish a document, you would get perhaps the latest version and the previous version out of the CMS or out of wherever your content is stored. Run that comparison automatically as part of your publication workflow, create the change view, and then that can flow straight through into the publication. If you're wanting to see changes some other way, perhaps see changes to the review process, see changes as you're editing, then it might fit somewhere else in your workflow. Again, it depends on precisely what you want the changes for.
Okay, so it sounds like you have many different options. It really depends on the specific business needs and the right place to slot it. Okay, excellent. Can I have one last question? In your experience, do you see or anticipate people publishing change in PDF?
Yes. There's always this question of, is PDF dead? And you get lots of people saying, yes, it is, but the evidence out there suggests otherwise. We get a lot of customers who still have their end result as a PDF, and they still have people using paper-based products. So there needs to be a way, really, of being able to publish change in that format. It does mean that you have to think about static ways of visualizing change, and it's perhaps more interesting to think about the dynamic ways and thinking about interactive methods of showing differences in documents that HTML and web apps give you. But yes, there's still absolutely a market there for publishing to PDF, and then therefore the need to be able to create and view changes in PDF.
Okay, excellent. Yes, and just speaking from DCL, what we see a tremendous volume in PDF. That has not been diminishing, so we would agree with that statement. Well, thank you to everyone for attending this webinar. This concludes today's broadcast. You can access the recorded version from the webinar archive section of our website, www.dclabs.com. We hope to see you all in our webinars in the future, and have a great day. Thank you.